Welcome back. In this seventh introductory lecture, I want to get to that third value of equality. So I've introduced order, which is the number one political value in most of Asia. Freedom, the number one political value in America, when I asked that on the exam. You should also be aware of this potential conflict between individual liberties or civil liberties and civil rights for groups. Today, I want to get to the value that your textbook emphasizes, and in fact, essentially is the heart of Chapter 4 and heavily referenced in Chapter 1. In this notion of equality, there is a debate between people who emphasize what I consider to be an ideal equal opportunity versus those who emphasize equal result. If you look at equality, this is the number one value in countries like Italy and Sweden. It is the number one political value in most European societies. I stole an exam question from US News and World Report, which asked an interesting question, at least it was interesting to me. It is the government's responsibility to reduce income differences between people. Now, you would expect that in a country that emphasizes freedom, like the United States, hold on a second. If freedom is your number one political value, your answer to that question should obviously be no. If equality was your number one value, the answer to that should be yes. And if it was order, you probably didn't have a strong feeling either way. Now take a look at the numbers as you follow down in your notes. That same question was asked in Italy, and 91% of Italians said yes, it is the government's responsibility to reduce income differences between people, and only 9% said no. So obviously, if you are running for political office in Italy, the speech you make is going to be very, very different than in the United States. Now, one thing that is not in the notes, and I left it out because it's rather ambiguous, is that the research seems to suggest that there is kind of a political value civil war going on between older people. God, I hate to put myself in that category because I think for my age, I'm actually very young thinking, and I don't fit in very well in a group of people my age in their 60s. I feel a lot more comfortable in a room full of people in their 20s. But the research suggests that younger people, especially those under 30, are increasingly placing a higher and higher emphasis on the notion of equality, saying that they're willing to give up a little bit of freedom in order to have greater equality. And this is important because Greenberg in chapter 4, I believe, gives some statistics that are rather chilling. There is greater income and wealth inequality in the United States than any other advanced industrial society in the world. Now, if freedom is your number one political value, you may say, well, that's the price you pay, that there are winners and losers. And in this particular case, if that means there's a lot of income and wealth inequality, that's not a concern of mine. But if equality is your number one political value, then you might come to the conclusion that capitalism is inhumane, it's exploitative. If you take a look, I found the statistics from the chapter interesting, and I listed them in your notes, right? If you take a look, 24% of Black Americans, 21% of Hispanics, 11% of Asians, and 9% of whites live in poverty. And I will admit that I have a certain amount of bias. I grew up very, very poor. Neither of my parents graduated from high school. only one of my four grandparents even went to high school. Three stopped after the 8th grade. I don't believe that my father ever earned $12,000 in a year. And so if I have a bias, if I'm going to talk about my people, some people talk about my people in terms of race, some people in terms of gender. But for me, my people are the poor. And I'm not really concerned about your plumbing or your paint job. If you're poor, you kind of belong to me. And, it's one of the reasons why I emphasize education. In this particular case, I believe that education is the best vehicle of social mobility. Yeah, you can get lucky and marry into a wealthy family or win the lottery or be that rare person who doesn't go to college and comes up with a wonderful invention. But in my case, I live a nice middle class lifestyle that I would have thought unimaginable as a child. So my belief, you either educate young people, you invest money in them, or you don't invest in young people and then you invest in them later when they're in prison, because we know that the greatest predictor of incarceration is illiteracy. So I have a bias towards education. I've devoted my whole adult life to higher education. And so equality is an important value. For me, equality and freedom are, all three of these values are really, really important. But equality probably has something special for me, given my life experience. Now, if you take a look in your book, and it's in chapter 4, I've forgotten where you can find this. There's a box, and it's called Individualism in America. You don't need to look at it because I took the relevant data from that chapter. And essentially, it is a freedom versus order question. Instead of asking a very specific question like U.S. News and World Report did, your textbook asked, which is more important to you? And I want you to think about this. And in fact, I think this would actually be something, nice to, discuss amongst yourselves. Certainly, it would be an intriguing thing to get some cross-fertilization. At Stanislaus, hopefully my SI leaders might address the battle between civil liberties and civil rights, the paradox between majority rule and minority rights, which is more important. But I think another one might be this battle between freedom and equality. So the freedom box, the first one, is emphasizing freedom. Is it more important to pursue life's goals? Right? So there you go. So in this particular case, should I have the freedom to be the best, the brightest, the wealthiest, the whatever? Is that most important? And should government allow that with minimal or no interference? The other category is it most important that government guarantee that nobody or very few are in need? Is that what's most important? So if you think that the freedom to pursue life's goals is most important, you're a freedom person. If you think that government should step in and guarantee that nobody is in need, or you could change that to, I don't like the wording of that a minimal number of people in need is most important. And take a look at the numbers. You have 3 European countries, Great Britain, Germany, and France, and you will notice that in all of the European societies, equality was prioritized over freedom. In Great Britain, Germany, and in France, all of them, a majority of the electorate said that the government should guarantee that nobody in need is most important. And you see that in European public policy. European countries tend to have a more generous welfare state. Their welfare benefits are more generous. Their unemployment insurance is more generous. Their minimum wage is much higher. Uh, for example, we have places in the United States where the minimum wage is less than $8 an hour. And in some European societies, you have a minimum wage that is around $20 an hour. Now, to be fair, the tax rate is much higher in these European societies. But essentially, the argument is you pay more in taxes, but you get more back in services. And I've always said, and you'll hear this again from me probably in a future tape, but to me this makes sense. For me, there's two groups that make sense to me. People who are willing to pay a lot of taxes, but in return they're going to get a lot of services. For example, high tax rate, but you're going to get health care guaranteed for free. You're going to get a higher education. You can get a college degree, tuition free or minimal tuition. You're going to get a lot back. You're going to get a more generous maternity, paternity leave, and you can go on and on. High taxes, high service. That makes sense to me. Are people who don't want the government to do very much. They don't want to pay very high taxes, and they don't want much in return. So Scandinavia makes sense to me, high taxes, high services. And a state like Mississippi, where taxes are pretty low and where governmental services are very low. That also makes sense to me. The problem is, though, for me, it seems like Americans want Swedish services and want to pay Mississippi taxes. And to me, the result of that has been wanting to get a lot for as little as possible. It's getting a free lunch. And the result has been tremendous debt. And at some point, there are going to be economic repercussions for it. So notice that the United States stands out, that in the U.S. freedom prevailed over equality. That just kind of reinforces Greenberg's graph that's in your notes, reinforces that point that I made earlier, that Americans are the most individualistic society in the world, that we see a triumph of freedom over equality, although there may be a political revolution occurring because younger people are increasingly embracing equality. But overall, traditionally, at least for a long period of time, Americans really do not want government to play a major role in determining life's economic outcomes. It's intriguing that we will look to the government for help, and certainly we have seen this during this pandemic. During this pandemic, we have seen a lot of people who have been unemployed, and the federal government and the states have kind of partnered, and for several months now, the government has stepped in and provided enhanced unemployment for people who have been displaced from their jobs. Extra $600 a week. We'll see if that continues or not. So to me, it is intriguing that in times of crisis, and sometimes not even in times of crisis, we as Americans will look to the government for help. But we don't trust government. We don't tend to like government. We kind of see it as a necessary evil. I'm a believer that government can do good. Certainly, I will use the example of higher education. It fundamentally transformed my life. I was lucky. I paid $2 a semester to go to a community college. When I graduated, I went to a Cal State and I paid $90 a semester. And then when I went to UC Davis for my graduate school, I got a tuition offset and a teaching assistantship. So the people of California paid for my education, and I'm trying to repay the favor.